sharing my professional and personal reaction to the Oprah podcast a few weeks ago on parent, adult, child estrangement, and family cutoffs. This is something I work with in my practice a lot. It's one of my main focuses in my practice after babies come, when boundaries are getting crossed and a lot of tension surfaces. Often this is one of the relationships that can cause the most stress for new parents. To navigate their own relationship with their parents. It brings up so much from the past often. Okay. Boundaries become more important, and protecting themselves and their new family becomes a heightened sense of responsibility. When I started working as a therapist, I was sitting with individuals and they were mourning their relationships with their parents. There was so much grief coming up about what they wished their relationship could be and what it wasn't. And I started thinking, well, if your child is still, if your parent is still living, why are we mourning something that has the potential to change? Of course, there are going to be, there were situations where there were parents who were not willing to come to therapy, were not willing to discuss anything. Their emotional abuse was relentless, consistently hostile. I'm not talking about those scenarios. In those scenarios where that kind of emotional abuse is relentless, is consistent, is not responsive to calm requests for repair, again, that's a whole different ball of wax, and it can be absolutely self-preservation to cut off in those situations. But there were plenty of clients that I had where their parents were maybe hesitant. Some were eager, some were hesitant, very natural, to come into the process. But I started saying, hey, if your parent wants to and if you want to, let's bring your parent into this process. And I started doing work with adult children and their parents. And again, when I started out a little bit more naive, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be this magical process where, they don't have to mourn this anymore, and they can repair all the wounds from childhood and be close and have this beautiful relationship moving forward. This doesn't have to be lost. There's still, years and years to have this kind of emotional intimacy. And sometimes that did happen, and it continues to be incredibly gratifying when that happens. And it's such a privilege to witness when that happens. And then sometimes you also see that that's not possible for a few reasons, right? Whether that's that really one member of the family that's working together is not willing, even with some help, even with some time, is really not willing to look at their own accountability, and just doesn't want to go into that process. Another reason is, I think, there is a desire, but it gets buried under so much defensiveness. So like in the therapy world, we call that really low capacity. Just, it's very hard for a person to have the emotional regulation to tap into being present with their own feelings, mixed feelings of grief, guilt, love, anger, and to be able to be present for their adult child or their adult parents' feelings. And there's so much dysregulation that it takes a lot of gradual work to get to a point of emotional regulation. And sometimes people will do that work, members of the family, and sometimes they won't. So there's a couple reasons, how this has gone in my practice. And so I have a real special interest in this. And yes, this is very specific to this time of life, when people have families. And what I saw with so many mothers and fathers is that it brought up a lot of, having their own children would bring up a lot of pain and triggers from their own childhood that would really layer on everything else they're contending with and adapting to at this stage of life, this kind of emotional weight, and then getting much more triggered than usual because, there's also a new role as a parent that they're adopting, wanting to protect themselves in a different way and their children in a different way. So it really doesn't matter if you've heard the Oprah episode or not. This episode is just going to give a view into what I see in my practice with clients who are grappling with cutoffs and boundaries in their family, and my general professional opinions based on what I see and what comes up for new parents. So, we know becoming a parent is just such a profound identity shift. It doesn't just change your schedules and amount of responsibility, it reshapes or emphasizes values, necessary boundaries, and kind of nervous system health. And because family relationships already carry such a backlog of history and power dynamics, and it's very complex, parenthood will bring long-standing under the rug or like under the surface issues to the surface. So for example, let's say a new parent might suddenly feel just a new layer of anger and overwhelm by a grandparent who insists on crossing boundaries, not showing kind of any respect for like an adult child, this new parent's kind of judgment, being judgmental and critical, showing some hostility, saying things like, oh, before kids, um, and before kids, those comments might have been just annoying, aggravating, but manageable. And after a baby arrives, it can feel like a threat almost to autonomy, peace, inner peace, emotional safety, and also concerns about how new children in the family will be affected as they grow up. We want to make sure, right, our children are not going to go through similar things that we went through that we know are really painful. So for others, the shift can come just also from clarity around this. A parent may realize, hey, I don't want my child witnessing how my needs get ignored again and again and again. I want to reiterate, I'm not talking about things happening here or there. In all relationships, no matter how healthy they are, there's going to be disagreements. People will be rude. Sometimes, like, those things are normative, and we want to, bring them up, repair, apologize, and move on. I'm only talking about when things are really repetitive, when it's just actually the dynamic in the relationship, the consistent dynamic. A parent might say, I don't want my child learning that love requires self-betrayal, that, of my own needs, that, I don't want my child thinking that we speak to each other in this cruel or unkind way and that that's normal. So what once might have felt like this is just how my family is, or just got to deal with this, sometimes will start feeling really incompatible with the environment they want to create and create, for their child in this new family. Often boundary settings are, huge red flags that come up. And triggers that come up in families. So a parent might say, hey, we're not discussing our feeding choices or, our co-sleeping choices or whatever it is, only to be met with lashing out, guilt trips, or withdrawal of love, like that there's punishment for placing boundaries. So when repair doesn't seem possible, or when boundaries are just repeatedly violated, distance can start to begin to feel like the only option when conflict resolution just doesn't seem possible. What looks sudden from the outside, maybe to other people, could be the result of months and years of buildup, combined with emotional exhaustion, hormonal changes, much less capacity to handle all these other things when you're handling this new responsibility of growing your family, because we know parents are already stretched thin. And so it's become much more common now to go against the idea that, hey, we stick with family members no matter what, which was the common, I think, consensus in our culture, and move to, no, if I have to protect myself or my children, we're going to go to cutoffs or extreme distancing. And I know this is a topic that resonates deeply for a lot of people, even if you're not at the point of cutoff. I hear so often, I just prefer to see less and less of my family. So I look, the Oprah podcast covered a lot of this in a really great way. And one of their strongest aspects, I would say, was the choice of experts. So the clinicians and thinkers that were there brought a lot of nuance and emotional, I think, attunement to the complexity of this issue in the time that was allowed. So, for example, instead of portraying estrangement as empowering or trendy, they're saying, look, this is not a black and white issue. Many people grieve very deeply after cutting off family, even when the decision is necessary. And they named the loneliness, the self-doubt, and judgment, from others, and the true wish that things could be different. There's also recognition that estrangement is rarely about just one event happening. So someone might cite like the last argument as a breaking point, but underneath that is often just a really long backlog, like what feels like a lifetime of being dismissed, controlled, manipulated, for example. And so that framing helps a lot of listeners understand that cutoffs are often a last resort, not a first response. But that isn't always the case, right? Like that is a compassionate and honest view of when, again, that kind of emotional abuse from a family member, from either the parent or the adult child, is really relentless and not open to any kind of repair. But there is not a one size fits all. And I think one critical point that deserves more emphasis here is that context matters, and it really depends on each relationship. I think a lot of people, on social media and just people in general want to see this as, hey, it's always bad to cut off with family, or hey, if someone thinks that's necessary, then that's good, and that should be defended always. I don't agree with either perspective. There's no universal answer when it comes to family cutoff. For example, someone who's distancing themselves from a parent who continues to drink very heavily around their child or engages in consistent verbal abuse is navigating a very different reality than someone cutting off contact after a few disagreements about holiday plans without any effort to talk things out or consider one another's point of view or in a back and forth exchange and have some kind of effort for repair. One parent may go no contact because repeated attempts at repair were met with gaslighting or retaliation, while another may feel just overwhelmed and uncomfortable with conflict that hasn't really had support in learning how to communicate boundaries or navigate that with help. And that's okay if that's unfamiliar. There's no judgment from me about that. But it's not the same thing. And, it's really dangerous to get swept up in an idea of, this feels emotionally unsafe to me, I'm cutting off. Well, there are truly situations of emotional unsafety, and there are also situations where these are normative disagreements in families in the lifespan, and if both members of that dyad, of the duo, are willing to talk things out, are willing to listen to one another, repair can happen. So if these situations are just flattened to just one single narrative, people might start feeling pressured to make decisions that don't actually fit their circumstances. Cutoffs aren't, again, they're not inherently healthy or unhealthy. What matters is that they're happening, how they're being handled, and whether these people are having internal and external support, and whether you're really getting what you want. I have seen, let's say, adult parent and children where I can tell they want to be connected. Their inner desire is that they are connected. They've expressed it in many ways. But that these narratives are like a difficulty dealing with emotional regulation is making it very hard. And it becomes easier to justify the cutoff rather than to struggle with the discomfort around learning how to tolerate conflict resolution. Okay. So, in other words, one of the experts, Ms. Tawwab, mentioned, is this annoying or is this toxic, right? Because toxic has become this one-size-fits-all word for things that are unpleasant. Sometimes it is. Sometimes emotional abuse is unrelenting, contemptuous, stonewalling, manipulation. Absolutely. That's, I would say, more cut and dry situation of, yes, protect yourself, protect your children, when there is no commitment or accountability to address behavior that is really cruel and consistently cruel. When things are more spread out and they're aggravating, annoying, these are things that have the potential to be worked out. Again, that requires both members of the family or more members of the family to listen to one another, to tolerate their feelings, to attune to someone else's experience. And I've seen both. Look, where there's real consistent emotional abuse, And an adult child understands that there's no potential for change, and self-preservation for themselves or spouses and their children means cut off. And I've also seen adult parents and children have very little capacity to tolerate their feelings, listening to their family members' feelings and experience, and to tolerate the process of repair and conflict resolution. And that's just different than toxicity. So there's just more nuance to this. And again, it just depends on each family and each relationship. Another area that was underdeveloped in the Oprah podcast, and I think this was just because of time limitations, was the role of the nervous system regulation. So if we think about the window of tolerance, which is basically just, let's say, a visual of, when we feel comfortable, when it's easy to listen to someone else, when it's easy to tune into ourselves, that's us being in a window of tolerance. And when we get out of that, I'm sure all of you can relate to this, moments where your whole body tenses, where you're ready to lash out or shut down or run away from something or avoid, right? That's where like reactivity gets high. We're not in our window of tolerance. Family interactions are activating, please, for all of us, right? A simple phone call with a parent might leave someone shaky, anxious, angry, or shut down, even if nothing major was said, because there is such a history that there can be a trigger that brings, a family member back to some painful places. And without help with regulation, people can go between two extremes, staying really engaged with family member while being very flooded, riddled with anxiety, snapping, yelling, or people pleasing, or shutting down, ghosting, avoiding, cutting off abruptly. So learning to recognize signs of deregulation, tight chest, racing thoughts, a quick urge to defensiveness can change outcomes of how people have the capacity for regulation. Learning to pause a conversation instead of forcing a resolution, as if someone's bleeding, right? Nobody's bleeding. I say this a lot. Like, you can table this until you're calmed down to come back to a conversation. This doesn't mean staying in harmful relationships. It doesn't mean being a doormat. It just is differentiating between this is unsafe always, or this is overwhelming in this moment. I'm not regulated. We need to come back to this. This goes for, parents and adult children. And I'll have another episode on getting deeper into regulation. But I want to point this out. This is so important. One huge factor I see in parents of adult children that make it extremely hard for them to stay present and attuned and show up for that repair with their kids, even though they also want a closer and better relationship, is the massive guilt they're sitting with. I have sat with outpourings of grief and guilt with hundreds of clients, and I will say it seems the most painful for a parent to have loving guilt towards their child. The love for a child is so intense, the sense of responsibility to protect them is so intense, that most parents, even if that love is buried very deeply in them, even if they don't make a lot of contact with it for a variety of reasons, but if they really have to face that they have hurt their children that they love, it's massively painful to sit with that kind of guilt. Guilt is healthy. I'm not talking about shame spirals or attacking yourself or anything, but just saying, I did something to hurt this person I love, and I didn't want to do that, and I'm so sorry that I did that. That motivates repair, but it's very hard to sit with. The expert Dr. Joshua Coleman in the episode actually spoke of his own experience with his daughter, which I love that he shared his own personal experiences with this and admitted as a therapist too, right? How hard it was for him to face his accountability towards his adult daughter and how defensive he got initially. And those defenses just, made the gap between him and his daughter just so wide. So, and that accountability, let me tell you, it is a magic wand. Adult children, I have seen this so many times. Adult children will have so much justified anger towards their parents. And when their parents get to a point of finally saying, I really see how hurt you were and how hurt you are. And I did that. And I'm so sorry. And when that's genuine, right, instead of defending or rationalizing or trying to nip it in the bud or brush it under the rug, when they do that, I see adult children just melt. It softens them incredibly. And they're like pulled back into the connection and wanting to have all this compassion for their parents all of a sudden because they're so hungry for that. So it's very powerful and very difficult. This is one of the biggest blocks that I see in this work. Having said that, I do want to mention, to be fair, I've seen a handful of situations, and this surprised me early on, where it was the adult child who was the one that was more deregulated, and the adult parent had more capacity to take feedback and accountability, and it was really hard for the child to recognize it and receive it. Again, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that sometimes it's just harder to have that capacity. Okay. So again, remember, there's a difference between authenticity and reactivity. For example, I'm not like saying something like, I'm not comfortable discussing my parenting choices and I'm going to change the subject now, versus you never respect me, you never will, I'm walking out. Both come from real feelings, but one is aligned with values and clarity around what the boundary is, and another is reactive. And I'm not criticizing it too. We all get to a point, right, where it's a boiling point when we haven't processed things. It's just going to be less productive in the relationship. That's all. And feelings and behaviors often get conflated. Like, a parent can feel furious without behaving cruelly. You can feel deeply hurt without completely disappearing. And so, we can feel big feelings without detonating relationships. Again, I'm not talking about relentless abuse, okay? But when people don't know that those distinctions exist, cutoffs become the only perceived path to self-expression or to something healthier. Okay. I thought the expert Dr. Gibson, just one of my final observations, she offered wonderful insights into her client work with this population. She did dance around the fact at the end of the episode that sometimes people struggle with how they speak, that they can come off aggressive and don't realize it. And that's true, but I could tell she was really dancing around the fact that some people, and I'm not saying this to criticize, but to face reality and have a lot of compassion, for people who don't have this capacity, that some have a profound difficulty with making assumptions about others, lashing out, tolerating feelings, communicating clearly, being able to also listen. And those struggles will shape and close opportunities for some kind of repair. And sometimes it's easier to say, hey, a family member is toxic, rather than to look at the dynamics, the mutual dynamics playing out in a relationship. Again, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about relentless manipulation and hostility, but in more normative conflicts that come up in all families, misunderstandings, hurtful words, disagreements, and such. So if there's a mutual commitment to repair, and if the repair isn't approached as an attack, but rather as in an honest way with regulated anger and love, more can be workable. And certainly more of us family therapists are doing this adult parent-child work. It's my favorite relationship to work with, along with couples maybe in the same level. Love it. So overall, Oprah's podcast opened an important door. It's, a continuing discussion in our culture. It's important to validate the pain that people carry quietly, and I think there's a lot of shame around this still. But validation isn't enough. I think it's important to have these distinctions between what really is unworkable emotional abuse, which is never okay, and also what could be workable and why those challenges are there, and can we work around those challenges for more intimacy in families. Without skill building in this way and awareness around this, people might mistake emotional anxiety and overwhelm for reactivity. So, everybody, every family, every person deserves to have that kind of support and to choose intentionally, so we can be as fulfilled as possible in our relationships. Decisions about contact deserve more than slogans or moral judgment. They deserve a lot of care, attunement, specificity to each experience, and attunement to that and context. So I'm curious to hear if any of you have experience with this. Please comment here if you have any questions about what I talked about today, or comments or feedback. And I will be offering resources later in the year to help adult parent-child relationships after babies come. So subscribe here to find out when that's coming. I'm here for you and your family. See you next week. Goodbye.